another half. So we're in St Thomas the Apostle's Church. The site is near the ruins of St Thomas's Priory and was once a priory church. It was largely built in the 15th century, but the lower part of the tower is 14th century, I believe. We know this as records show that around 1482, there were costs incurred in the purchase of the bells and the repairing of the bell tower. Some of the carved stonework has very likely come from the ruins of the nearby priory, such as the font that you can see at the back. The cemetery of St Thomas was consecrated on November the 6th, 1333 by Bishop Grandison, which coincides with why the lower part of the church is older. Supposedly near the church is the commencement of a subterranean passage leading, it is believed, to Launceston Castle, and by which access to the River Kenzie flowing near it could be had in time of siege. There has been some debate as to the function of the small square opening in the tower with the iron grating. One theory is that it was used to give the Lord's Supper to lepers, which is based on the fact that there was formerly a leper hospital in the neighbourhood. As we have seen in many of the Cornish churches, it underwent restoration work during the Victorian period, overseen by J.P. St Alban, and we know his name comes up quite a lot. Not mentioned in the Domesday Book, the first mention of the church in writing is as a chapel in 1288 AD, and at this time it was dedicated to St Thomas A. Becket. The dedication was changed to St Thomas the Apostle sometime around the same time as the dissolution of the priory. In fact, the dedication of many St Thomas churches was changed from Thomas Becket, St Thomas of Canterbury, to Thomas the Apostle during the English Reformation in the 16th century by order of King Henry VIII. Two other churches dedicated to St Thomas are particularly well known, Exeter and London. Exeter's was constructed in around about 1412, and it was heavily involved in the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549. The church in London, now no longer extant, once existed on London's Knight Rider Street since the 12th century, but was completely destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. The modern civil parish was created in 1894 from part of the older parish of St Thomas the Apostle Rural, its technical parochial name. This was due to the Local Government Act of 1894, which directed that civil parishes were no longer allowed to straddle borough boundaries, and so the parish was split along the borough boundary. Therefore, at this time, the ecclesiastical parish of St Thomas the Apostle, in effect, straddled three civil parishes. The ecclesiastical parish was also sometimes known as St Thomas by Launceston, and these two names have both continued as legal names for the civil parish, used interchangeably. The civil parishes of St Thomas Street and St Thomas the Apostle Urban were abolished in 1922 when all the urban parishes within the borough were united into a single parish, and I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, I'm so sorry, called Dydh, otherwise known as Launceston. Further back, though, in 1726 AD, St Thomas the Apostle Rural became a parish in its own right, where St Thomas's Church became the parish church. Its parish boundaries covered an area south of the River Kenzie and north of the castle and the old walled town, and also extending into rural areas to the west of the town. Despite the fragmentation of the civil parishes, the ecclesiastical parish remains almost covering the same area as it did in 1726. Even earlier than that, though, St Thomas's Church was originally in the parish of St Stephen's by Launceston, Rural, where it functioned as a chapel of ease for St Stephen Church, its mother church, seen in taxation records of Pope Nicholas, 1288 to 1291. St Stephen is also to whom the priory was dedicated. This means that for much of its life, St Thomas's Church functioned as both a chapel of ease of St Stephen and the priory church. A chapel of ease functions as a convenient place of worship for congregations who live too far away from the main parish church and are well dispersed, whereas a daughter church is an extension of the main parish church and very often was dependent on it. I actually wasn't sure either of the difference, so I thought you might be interested to know as well. The rural in the parish name encompasses much of the rural land in the Kenzie Valley, historically used mainly for agricultural purposes, but it also has been home to manganese mining and limestone quarrying. More urban as well as a serge material factory and other woolen or combing establishments, there were also a number of tanneries by the River Kenzie, all now no longer in existence. And what about the name Launceston itself? The parish of St Stephen was once home to an Anglo-Saxon monastery, and this is where they think the name Launceston derives, from Lan Stephen Tun. Lan meaning holy area and developing in the medieval period to mean church, Stephan referring to St Stephen, and tun, the Anglo-Saxon word meaning, among other definitions, an enclosed settlement. A mint was established here as early as the reign of Ethelred II in 976, but only one specimen is known to exist, and I managed to find that it weighs 1.61 grams, in case you were interested. The mint is thought to have continued to produce coins into the reign of Henry II. However, after the Norman conquest, the Norman Earl, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, acquired Dydh and rebuilt the castle there. During this time, the castle became the chief legal and administrative centre for Cornwall. The name of Launceston originally belonged to the monastery and town here, but was then transferred to the town of Dydh as well, hence the word Lan in the name. Back even further in time again, St Thomas's Church functioned as the priory church of St Thomas's Priory. It had its own priest, given his own sermons. The priory was of the Augustine order and was established in 1155. It was prosperous throughout the medieval period for almost 400 years. That is, until the Reformation. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because otherwise I'm taking from Rob's talk. Destruction of the ecclesiastical landscape. Several pivotal events throughout the history of the British Isles led to these paintings disappearing from collective memory. To begin, the break from Rome in the early 1530s. Long story short, Henry wanted a male heir, thus he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, who was now in perimenopause, and marry Anne Boleyn, who was still fertile. But the papacy kept stalling, and so Henry took matters into his own hands. In 1534 comes the Act of Supremacy. Henry VIII leaves the See of Rome and declares himself supreme head of the Church of England. Many religious houses were destroyed during the two Dissolutions Acts in 1536 and 1538 respectively. They were enacted by Thomas Cromwell, a staunch reformer, a way to both control the church and to gather funds for the royal treasury. Other royal injunctions of 1538 prohibited the veneration of images by pilgrimage, offerings or lights, while another royal proclamation of the same year suppressed the cult of Thomas Becket, hence why we see a lot of these churches changing their dedications from Thomas Becket to Thomas the Apostle. And Becket became a potent symbol of religious martyrdom. By banning his following, was it a way for Henry VIII to affirm himself as supreme head of state and church? Was he trying to prevent people seeing the similarities in the situations and being called to action? Parish churches may have escaped the dissolutions, but they were ransacked. Paintings were covered, rood screens were dismantled, local saints' days abolished, etc., causing distress, dismay and disillusion with Henry's reign, which once showed such promise. By 1540 AD, Launceston Priory had been dissolved and its assets stripped. Meanwhile, St Mary Magdalene Church nearby is the parish church for the parish of Launceston and was also originally under the management of Launceston Priory. This makes me wonder, would the churches of Cornwall still have been as brightly painted today if not for the Reformation or Civil War destruction? Or would the methods of social instruction, or at a push, social control, have been enacted differently as the general literacy rates of the population increased? Oh, I don't know the answers to those questions, by the way. They're just something to think about, if anyone has any ideas. We can talk about that later. That's fine. So this would be the little point where if you want a little break, we can have it, or I can just plough straight on. Carry on? Okay. So the paintings then, which I don't know why you're here for. One wall painting and a fragment of another have been found at the eastern end of St Thomas's Church. Discovered during restoration in 1872, it depicts the Roman Catholic legend of St Roch. Guardian against plague, he was likely painted in the 14th to 15th century. He's wearing a pilgrim's habit with an angel bringing ointment for his wounds and a dog carrying bread for his hunger. St Christopher was likely also represented, and potentially was the fragment you mentioned earlier, Rob, was that potentially St Christopher? Or we didn't know. But we know there was once a St Christopher here, as we know is common in a lot of churches. Not least due to a known 1510 guild dedication here to St Christopher. The English Heritage listing lists only one painting, and so it's very likely that the second one was found relatively recently or has since been destroyed. Churches dedicated to Cornish saints seem more prevalent in the southern areas of Cornwall. Might there be a correlation with less Anglo-Norman influence there, and so the Cornish identity was stronger? Churches dedicated to Cornish saints also seem more likely to contain wall paintings depicting Cornish saints, and this may have aided their evasion of complete destruction suffered by many of the more universal saints. All of the current examples in the main data set could be considered on the peripheries, far from the main body of the peninsula, and thus more likely able to avoid drastic destruction, which I find interesting because we know Launceston used to be one of Cornwall's capitals. So I think you're very blessed that he's managed to survive, because you would think when you have, obviously, laws enacted by the king, the places that are more likely to enact those are the bigger towns and the capital cities, or capital towns. So some socio-political history now. On Wednesday, September the 24th, 1438, a quarrel between two men of the town Launceston took place in St Thomas's churchyard, with one being a fisherman named Robert Simon. Blood was apparently shed, which at the time was deemed a pollution of the place. It is said that, although a great pestilence was then reigning, all interments in the cemetery were suspended until the pollution had been expurged. A solemn inquiry was therefore held in the chapel of St Thomas, with the court consisting of Thomas Uppen, Esquire, who sat for John Stephen, the mayor of Dunheved, Nicholas Tregojek, and William, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, Stotterreich, and others. Robert Simon was found to be guilty, but there is no record of his punishment. Just a little story there. A little bit more about St. Thomas. St. Thomas the Apostle was one of the 12 apostles, the closest disciples of Christ. In fact, it is St. Thomas who gave rise to the phrase doubting Thomas, as it took him a while to believe the rumours that Christ had been resurrected from the dead until he tangibly felt his wounds. He is particularly venerated in India, where he travelled extensively spreading the gospel. In fact, many churches in the Middle East and Southern Asia, besides India, also mention Apostle Thomas in their historical traditions as being the first evangelist to establish those churches. He was born in Galilee and he died in 72 AD in what is now modern India. He is considered the patron saint to all the Christians living in India. He is commonly associated with a spear, a lance, or a javelin, which is used to represent his martyrdom. A little bit more about St. Roch. St. Roch was said to have been born in Montpellier, which is obviously now in modern-day France, in about 1348 AD, supposedly with a birthmark in the shape of a red cross, which is said to have grown throughout the course of his life. His birth itself was said to have been a miracle. His mother was supposedly barren until she prayed fervently to the Virgin Mary. He is regularly portrayed with a dog, not least because he is known as the patron saint of dogs, which I thought was quite a fun fact. St. Roch's dog is also sometimes conflated with the folk saint, St. Gwynefort, the Holy Greyhound. He is also the patron saint of invalids, falsely accused people, bachelors, as well as several other things. It's quite a long list, so I'll leave you to find that out later. He is the patron saint of several towns in modern-day Italy and Spain, and this is likely due to the fact that he travelled to several towns in Italy and the Basque Country, entering during an epidemic of plague. And during this time, he's known for caring for the sick in all of the towns that he visited. He inevitably became ill himself and went to become a hermit in the forest, where it is said he would have died if not for a miraculous spring which appeared out of nowhere and a hunting dog which gave him bread and licked his wounds. The dog's owner, Count Gottardo Palestrelli, then brought him home and nursed him back to health. As seen here, he's usually depicted in art with a wound on his thigh, a dog offering bread, and often a pilgrim's hat and a pilgrim's staff. He died in August, either 1376 or 1379, we're not quite sure, in Voghera, which is now in the Lombardy region of Italy. He was arrested there, accused of being a spy, actually on the orders of his own uncle. He was subsequently thrown into prison where he languished for 5 years until his death. He is often prayed to protect against diseases such as plague, cholera, and leprosy. He was widely invoked during the medieval period to stop plagues, making him a common subject for protection against outbreaks, and likely the reason why he is painted here. This also actually supports the theory that the small square opening in the tower with the iron grating was in fact used to give the Lord's Supper to lepers. And to close, because I know John likes this, we've got a poem. I'm going to read you a little poem extract from Cornish poet and seaman in the Royal Navy Charles Causley, whose hometown is Launceston, 1917 to 2003, and he's actually buried in the churchyard here next to his mother's grave if you get a chance to pop around after. Shades of the dim and distant ages past are lingering yet around these ancient walls, in this retreat where stood St. Austin's halls, naught of whose former glory doth outlast time's ravages, for even the name is fading fast. Time-honoured spot, thy leafy rural bower, how calm and peaceful in its deep repose. On Sabbath morn or dewy evening's close, meet stillness reigns that suits the solemn hour. All things around thee nature's beauties wear, sweet sylvan scene, we love to wander there. Clad in its vesture bright of summer green, here the long avenue to musing leads. Unheard the neighbouring stream in silver sheen runs gently by to glad the distant meads. Church of our fathers, mid this beauteous glade, here dost thou stand apart in sombre shade. Thank you for listening.